good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to a special live Q&A on marijuana in Canada. I'm Zach Goudie in St. John's, Newfoundland. This is your chance to have your questions answered on one of the hottest topics of the day. Joining me now from Toronto, Ontario, we'll welcome Rory McGee from Dig Insights. Rory is a research director at the Toronto-based market research firm. Rory, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks for having me, Zach.
Now, Dig Insights has just released a major study into recreational marijuana consumption and public opinion in the United States and Canada. Why do we need this information now, Rory?
Well, we need this information because it looks like legalization is upcoming in Canada, and quite frankly, we don't know what's going to happen in the United States, where we have 8 states plus DC who have recreational marijuana legalized. But the federal government there, Jeff Sessions, is looking like he wants to crack down on it. So it's an issue that's really apropos to our time.
Now, your company's research has revealed that there are quite a lot of differences between the way that Canadians and Americans not only view recreational marijuana, but consume it also. Today, it's a chance for our audience to ask questions of you directly, to hear what your research has to say about these subjects. For people who are watching us on Facebook, you can join this conversation by putting your questions or comments directly into the comments field. I'll get them to Rory McGee, Research Director with Dig Insights. Also, if you're watching us on the CBCNL website or the CBCNL YouTube channel, sit back, relax, and enjoy. So, Rory, tell us about this research. Tell us, first of all, about give us the executive summary about Canadians' opinions and usage patterns when it comes to recreational marijuana.
Absolutely. And just for the background for viewers and listeners, we interviewed 1,100 Canadians and 1,100 Americans. So it's a good sample size, and it's a representative sample size of both countries. And what we wanted to find out is both the attitudes of whether people want marijuana legalized, the usage of marijuana, and then also how legalization would impact other industries. So that could be alcohol, that could be quick service restaurants, or consumer packaged goods. In Canada, it was interesting that nearly 1 out of 4 Canadians said they have used marijuana in the past year. And there's 1 out of 5 that are saying, hey, if it became legal, I might try it. And in some ways, the people that you would think would use it, such as millennials, men, those really aren't surprising. They index higher on marijuana usage than you would think. In fact, 12% of men aged 18 to 34 in Canada use marijuana daily.
Rory, those numbers, I think, would be quite surprising to people, especially the top line that 24% of Canadians are currently using marijuana at least once in the past year, and a further 19% say they would potentially use it were it to become legal. So that's greater than 1 in 3 Canadians, again, who may well become customers of a legal marijuana market.
Exactly. Zach, one of the things that we looked at is we focused on these potential users, and we asked them what their current barriers are to consuming marijuana. And some of the barriers won't necessarily be overcome. The number one was the desire to stay in control. So that may not be overcome, but the second barrier was the fact that it's illegal. And another key barrier was the fact that people don't like to smoke. And as we move towards a legal and regulated market, first of all, marijuana is going to be legal in that case. And in a regulated market, producers could create edibles. And then that removes the barrier of people not wanting to smoke. So you may see that in this regulated environment, these potential users do move forward with, again, trying marijuana for the first time or going back to it and trying it again.
We want to remind people that if you have a question or a comment that you would like to pose to Rory McGee, again, a person who's been involved in a major study of recreational marijuana use in Canada and the United States, you can leave your questions or comments in the comment section of this Facebook Live video. Rory, we talked a moment ago about legalization and the potential, to get there in Canada, as well as, the uncertainty of where things are going in the United States. Let's stick with the Canadians' attitudes for just another moment and talk about another potential barrier for people who are considering consuming marijuana if and when it becomes legal, and that's the perceived harm that marijuana is perceived to cause by Canadians. What does your research tell us about that?
Our research tells us that Canadians most Canadians do not consider marijuana to be particularly harmful. Less than 1 in 5 said that marijuana is very harmful to its users. And that compares to 19% for alcohol, 25% for processed sugar, and 33% for saturated fat. So what we're seeing is that Canadians don't really think marijuana is that harmful. So in that case, and one of the comparison points is that if you look at truly damaging drugs, also Scheduled 1 controlled substances in the United States, 9 out of 10 say heroin and crack cocaine are very harmful.
Rory, we have a question for you from our Facebook audience from Paul Howell, who wants to know, will the legalization of marijuana also allow the sale of other marijuana-based products? You talked a moment ago about consumers' desire for ways to consume marijuana without having to smoke it, without having to inhale combusted carbon into their lungs with all the known side effects that causes. So will the legalization of marijuana allow the sale of the products you talked about, like edibles? We're already seeing a big part of that into the market, but also other THC-based products like hash or hash oil.
Unfortunately, at this point, it's somewhat uncertain. The federal government has come out with an estimated date, but some of the intricacies of the law have yet to be determined. What we can tell you is that allowing things like edibles and allowing things like THC products would probably increase consumption of marijuana. And it was interesting that particularly in the US market, it looks like there's a bit of a trade-off between marijuana consumption and alcohol consumption. So in the US, 37% of current marijuana users said they would consume more marijuana if it became legal. While at the same time, if we talk about current and potential users of marijuana, 3 out of 10 actually said they would consume less alcohol. So just going back to that question, it's a complicated trade-off because if the government allows things like edibles, they may increase consumption of marijuana, but at the same time, they may actually decrease the consumption of alcohol. So it's a tricky situation for them.
Rory, I have a comment from a Facebook viewer, Daryl Power, who says that no, he has got no interest in consuming marijuana, I guess whether it becomes legal or should stay illegal. What does your research tell you about the people who, again, like Daryl Power, currently have no interest? Are they likely to be won over to become marijuana consumers simply because it is legally available?
Not necessarily. In terms of usage, over half of Canadians, 57%, said, I haven't used marijuana in the past year, and even if it becomes legal, I'm not likely to try it. So there's still a strong contingent of people that are just not interested in it, and that's absolutely okay. What we found, though, is that those people are not always necessarily opposed to legalization. In some ways, I think some of those people understand the benefits of moving this towards a regulated market where the government generates tax revenue from it, and there's not an opportunity cost of police dollars being put into stopping this and not stopping potentially more damaging criminal activity.
Rory, another question from a Facebook audience. Zoe Dempster wants to know about who is the audience for your data, the data collected in these large public opinion surveys. Will this data help to influence federal or provincial policy as those policy makers now race to lock this down, to come up with these new rules under the timeline set by the federal government? Have you had contact with policymakers at any level of government interested in your data? Just tell us about who the audience is for your numbers.
So Dig Insights is a full-service market research firm, and we have a number of clients in the alcohol industry and in the consumer packaged goods and in quick-serve restaurants. So one of the things that we really want to figure out is how legalization and increased consumption of marijuana would impact those brands. Now, if governments want to use this data, we did ask about where people want marijuana sold. If governments want to use this information, we are absolutely open to it.
Rory, another question from our Facebook audience, this time from Bev Mugford. This is a variation on the classic gateway drug question when it comes to marijuana. Bev Mugford wants to know, by legalizing marijuana, wouldn't we be helping people to get addicted to other drugs if they don't get high enough or sufficiently satisfied from the product they're consuming? Might this then open the doors in their minds, at least, to trying other drugs they hadn't previously considered? Has your research given you any insight into that?
That's a good question from Bev. The Cannabis Culture Report that we put together does not get into this directly. So I just want to be clear that there's been no direct research done on is marijuana a gateway drug. What I can tell you, though, and just going back to the alcohol thing, is that there is to a certain degree a if we look at the gateway in terms of what are people not doing, if people are consuming marijuana, there's a likely chance that they're consuming less alcohol. So there is sometimes you have to think about the benefit and the trade-off in terms of what are people doing and not doing.
Rory, I have a practical question from Holly Simon, again, another Facebook viewer. Holly is asking about something that a lot of people are asking about. And these sorts of nuts and bolts regulations, again, this is very much still being figured out as we speak by policymakers across the country. Holly wants to know about driving. When we talk about the potential harms of marijuana, we had a slide on that a moment ago. We're talking about the harms to us as individual consumers, potential consumers of marijuana, harm we're doing to our own body and our own health by consuming this or other drugs. But what about the social harm of things like, again, an increased number of people consuming marijuana, and presumably some of them will get behind the wheel and drive. Also, Holly has a specific question about the amount of marijuana that will be allowed in a person's system. Again, Holly, I can tell you that that is something that the provincial government and police forces across the country are working on at this very moment. But was this also, again, did your research give you any insight into how people feel about other people on the road driving high? What level of being high is appropriate for other drivers? Has your research answered any of those questions?
That's definitely an important issue. We didn't ask about the perceptions of people driving high. What I can tell you is that, yes, provincial governments are absolutely looking at ways to measure how high people are when they're driving. This is going to be important policy to put into place. In terms of social harms, and this is one of the things we looked at, was what are people consuming when they are high on marijuana? And what we found is that in terms of quick serve restaurants and in terms of food, Lay's was the #1 chip preferred by people who have consumed marijuana in the past year. And McDonald's, surprise, surprise, was the preferred quick serve restaurant among those users. And it was kind of interesting because Taco Bell was actually the most preferred in the United States.
Wow. And here's another question that dovetails right into what you were just talking about this very serious business of marijuana and marijuana marketing. A question from our CBCNL YouTube channel, a user wants to know, why would anyone invest in a marijuana company today?
That's a good question. I believe the first marijuana ETF was released a couple of weeks ago. So this is absolutely becoming a big business. Well, why would they want to invest is that there's a number of LPs. I think there's about 35 of them right now. And if it becomes legal, these are going to be legitimate businesses who turn a profit, hopefully, and then provide money back to their shareholders. So the idea of it being an underground business is changing.
Rory, your research revealed, or rather covered the topic of how people spend their time while consuming marijuana. Gary, we've got a slide that's about activities, and I'm wondering if we could talk about this next, Rory. You talked about Canadians' fast food preferences, potato chip preferences while they're using marijuana. What did your research reveal about the other ways in which people spend their time while high?
That's a good question. In some ways, what they spend their time doing is somewhat stereotypical. A lot of people reported that they watch TV and listen to music, socialized. What we found, though, also was that 3 to 10 Canadians reported drinking alcoholic beverages at the same time as consuming marijuana, which some scientific studies show is not necessarily good for the brain. I think going back to a previous question on the driving one of the reasons for moving towards regulation legalization is allowing more studies to being done on stuff like driving while high and the effects of drinking alcohol and consuming marijuana at the same time while high. So to answer her question, the driving issue is something that we need to look into more to understand the science of it. And this report is not a scientific study. But going back to the alcohol thing, what we found that was interesting was that young people were actually less likely to report drinking alcohol and combining that with marijuana the last time they consumed marijuana. So it looks like in some ways younger people may actually be consuming marijuana in healthier ways. They're more likely to vaporize.
You know, some of the activities that were up on your chart a moment ago, how people spend their time, 43% of people report watching television, 38% are listening to music, 33% are eating, 32% socializing with friends. You could almost summarize all this by saying they're going about their normal lives. They're not doing anything, you know, particularly different or special necessarily anyhow while consuming marijuana.
Yeah, and Zach, that was an interesting thing. We've taken a look at daily users of marijuana versus sort of light and casual users of marijuana. And it's interesting that what these people do and their perceived benefits are actually quite different. It was something like 6 out of 10 daily users actually feel like marijuana makes them more energized and more focused. So these are people that, at least from a perception point of view, they're perceiving cognitive benefits from this. And then on the flip side, when you talk about someone who's a light user of it, they feel funnier, they're more likely to be socializing with friends. It is really a social activity.
We've got about 10 more minutes with Rory McKee. For anyone who wants to get in a question, again, Rory McGee is the research director at Dig Insights, a market research firm in Toronto. They have conducted a vast public opinion survey on Canadians and Americans' use of recreational marijuana and about how people feel about recreational marijuana and the incoming legalization regime that we have in Canada. Rory, a comment from another Facebook viewer named Christy Lee Bailey. She is directing her comment to Bev Mugford, who a moment ago brought up the issue of driving while high. Christy Lee Bailey says, the Bev Mugford's perception of these dangers are wrong, that marijuana has more medical qualities and is, in fact, a plant and not a drug. She says that research is key. You talked a moment ago about the different ways in which people perceive marijuana. Has this kind of divide between those who see it as a drug, like alcohol, perhaps like cocaine or like heroin, and those who perceive marijuana as more of a traditional medicine? Does this really inform people's perceptions of all of the topics, really, that we're discussing today?
I think it does. I think that is a very good point, and it's an interesting philosophical debate of what is it and what are people using it for. Stuff like CBD oil appears to take the THC, aka psychoactive properties, out of marijuana, and that gives you more of the beneficial body effects. Again, I'm not an expert on the actual products, but so you're seeing that products are actually coming out that in some ways take those divide and make them very literal.
Rory, I have a question from Cecilia Mercer, who wants to know about the distribution once marijuana has become legalized. She's wondering why governments want to, in some cases, sell marijuana in the provincially regulated liquor stores. She's wondering if part of your research indicates whether using dispensaries, the way that we see in some major cities like Toronto, like Vancouver, where marijuana legalization has already de facto occurred. She's wondering, is there a difference in the way that, I guess, again, when we talk about the social harm, when we talk about consumption patterns, when we talk about how government is going to go about distributing this thing, is there a perceived one or the other strategy being better here?
I don't know if there's necessarily a strategy that's being better, but what we did find that was interesting is that users of marijuana are actually more likely to want what she described, which is the dispensary model, which is regulated or unregulated, independent outlets for getting marijuana, essentially moving towards a more capitalistic model. When we look at rejectors and potential users, they actually want something more formal. So they're looking for government-regulated, government-owned retailers or pharmacies.
Gary,
yeah, go ahead with Gary's question.
No, I just wanted to get a message to Gary in the control room. We actually do have a slide about buying marijuana and Canadians' preferences when it comes to where they want to purchase their marijuana. Again, Rory, as you were just saying, 65% of people who buy marijuana typically buy a quarter ounce or less, and that despite marijuana not yet being legal, fully 15% of marijuana users say they have purchased it at a dispensary, the kind we see, really proliferating these days in cities like Toronto and Vancouver.
Exactly. And it was interesting that, a couple years ago, the number of dispensaries blew up in those major cities, and it appears that they've slowly been shut down. And I think one of the benefits in terms of when we go back to social harm is that nearly 50% of marijuana purchases are in a home or in a car, and then also some other purchases are being made in public. Legalizing would take that sort of seediness out of it and make it a legitimate purchase. It was interesting, though, that we talked to users about sort of their perceptions of their actual experience buying. And 4 to 5 reported feeling very safe when making purchases, and 6 out of 10 said they never fear the police.
I have a comment from a viewer here in Newfoundland and Labrador who says that if the government does elect to distribute marijuana through liquor stores, that it'll be a really dumb move. Like you were saying, your survey clearly indicates people's preference for buying from dispensaries. And that last point that you were making about how people feel when they're purchasing marijuana. I mean, 4 out of 5, according to your study, say that they feel very safe when buying marijuana in a dispensary, even though that's illegal. And you can sort of, I think even anyone who's never bought marijuana can still intuit that it's a very different experience walking into a storefront and having a real conversation with a clerk rather than meeting somebody in a shady alley or jumping into a car late at night. I mean, you're talking about two different things here, right?
Yeah, exactly. I do want to clarify that actually 4 to 5, this was related to all purchases of marijuana. But you make a good point in terms of the legitimacy of making purchases in dispensaries. Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Oh, well, in fact, why don't I move on to a few more that are still coming in from Facebook? In
Sure.
fact, I've got one from Tracy Noseworthy. Again, a lot of people really have questions about the nuts and bolts of this thing. Tracy Noseworthy, again, is asking about drug testing. We know that with the new federal legislation, there is a mandate for provincial governments to provide their local police forces with a tool, a diagnostic tool, that is much more accurate, basically, than what police are using today. Tracy Noseworthy has a question about the saliva test, the sort of cheek swab, which is actually a DNA test. I think a lot of people think it's a saliva-based test. The roadside test that police currently administer, it is my understanding that's actually a DNA test. They simply take the sample from the inside of your cheek because that's an easy place to get a non-invasive place to get a DNA sample. But they're wondering, Tracy's wondering about how reliable is that kind of testing in determining when a person smoked marijuana, how impaired they are on marijuana at the time of the test. Does your research, give you any indication about that?
It doesn't. But I can tell you that the governments are working to get a tool that's as reliable as possible. And I know that if we talk about potential users, so these are people thinking about using marijuana, one of their concerns is how strong it is and the quality of it. So there's clearly, that's something that needs to be overcome in terms of a regulated market. So from a purchase and from a consumption perspective, having a regulated market with notes on the packaging saying percentage of THC may actually help people better gauge, quite frankly, how high they're going to get, and then will inform what other things they could be doing afterwards or while high.
Just to answer Tracy's question a little more, I can tell you that the current roadside testing to determine whether a person is driving high or not, in Newfoundland and Labrador, the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary, a provincial police force that polices St. John's, among other cities, they're administering at least one test per week, as in sending at least one sample to the lab per week. So there are currently people who are being charged with driving impaired under the use of marijuana. Also, I asked our provincial justice department when they intend to introduce the legislation that is required on the provincial side. The federal government throws the switch, but at the provincial level, all sorts of things needed to be decided, such as the age of consent, or rather the legal age for purchasing marijuana. Again, the provincial governments operate provincial police forces, lots to do there. Little things like, can you smoke in public? I mean, in the research that you guys conducted, did those everyday questions come up somewhat frequently?
So one thing in the Cannabis Culture Report that we don't have the data for yet, but we are going to get it for, is this idea of being able to purchase alcohol at the same location where you can buy or consume marijuana. So for example, can a bar sell marijuana and can a marijuana place sell alcohol? And this becomes a bit of a tricky situation again, which is what is the science of combining the two, and what can governments, specifically municipal governments, do to decide how they want to weigh those cost benefits.
Rory, I got a final comment from Joni Perry Sears, who says that I have seen the benefit of marijuana with regards to severe anxiety disorder, and it is important to know what type you're getting. And that requires stores with knowledgeable staff. And one of the themes that's come up again and again, and I guess is a strong current in your research, is that we need to know more about marijuana, about the current state of marijuana, and the fact is, with this having been a taboo subject for so long, it maybe is a little frightening how much we don't know.
That's very true, yes. It was interesting, going to her point, that half of Canadians, 51%, believe that there are many benefits to consuming marijuana. On the flip side, a third said that regular users of it are less successful in life. So clearly there is a lot to figure out, and there's, in terms of understanding the benefits and then also understanding the drawbacks and figuring out for governments how to communicate and mitigate those negative risk factors.
Well, Rory, it's certainly timely research for anyone who's interested in getting a closer look at the numbers we've been discussing today. You can find them on your website. That's diginsights.com/420. You guys are very clever, I guess, in bringing this research out at this specific time. Yesterday, obviously, is the big day in cannabis culture, right?
Yes, exactly. It was a rush to get this out, but we're happy we did. And it's an exciting time for both the Canada and the U.S.
Indeed. Well, again, we really appreciate your insight and your time today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Zach.
That is Rory McGee, a research director at Dig Insight in Toronto. So I'm Zach Goudie here in St. John's. I want to say a final thank you to our Facebook audience, our audience on the website and on CBCNL YouTube, and we hope you'll join us again next time. So long for now.